Good evening and welcome to this special edition of 60 Minutes. I'm Tara Brown. As if the murder of Corryn Rayney wasn't traumatic and incomprehensible enough for her family, the unrelenting police pursuit of her husband as the perpetrator must be one of the most appalling denials of justice and decency imaginable. Lloyd Rayney was a high-profile Perth barrister who was presumed guilty of the crime almost from the moment his wife's body was discovered in a bush grave. But that meant detectives missed or ignored other vital clues. As a consequence of the flawed investigation, whoever did murder Corryn remains unknown and unpunished. Now Lloyd Rayney wants the police to put aside their prejudice and find his wife's killer. It's a wonder Perth barrister Lloyd Rayney has any fight left in him. Falsely accused of the murder of his wife Corryn, he's beaten a $20 million police case to convict him. Now he's fighting for the truth. Who killed his wife and why are they still walking free?
Someone has literally gotten away with murder.
There were other possible suspects. There was other evidence. But it was all ignored by police, obsessed with Lloyd's guilt.
He is now a suspect in the murder of his wife.
It was like a runaway train that nobody could stop.
He's our only suspect at this time.
They can't admit that they got it absolutely wrong right from the beginning.
Lloyd is calling for a new investigation, for impartial police to find who really murdered his wife.
I think the evidence is there, and I think it just needs honest, hard-working, independent police. It needs different people to do the job properly.
"44-year-old Corryn Rayney couldn't know it, but Tuesday, the 7th of August 2007, would be the date of her untimely and tragic death. A death that will forever shape the lives of her husband and their daughters.
My mum died in 2007, and that's more tragedy than any family should ever have to deal with. It's time for that to stop, and it's time for justice to be served for my mother.
On that August evening, Corryn was boot scooting. Her Tuesday night ritual to escape the stress of being a registrar at Western Australia's Supreme Court. The dance class ended at 9:30 p.m, and Corryn was due home soon after. As it got later, Lloyd and daughters Caitlin and Sarah went to sleep, assuming she was out with friends. By next morning, there was still no sign of Corryn.
We were in separate bedrooms, and we thought she'd gone to work early. There was no reason to believe anything had happened.
Then a call from Corryn's office. She hadn't shown up there either.
I knew straight away that something's wrong. Corryn was very conscientious, loved her job. For her not to go to work, something was wrong.
What could have gone wrong?
Well, nothing made sense because Corryn was not someone who would go missing, and started to dwell on me, something's bad has happened, something's not right.
Lloyd immediately did all he could, helping police gain access to his wife's locked email account and desperately calling hospitals, family and friends.
None of those calls were fruitful. No one knew where Corryn was.
But hardest of all for this one-time prosecutor and seasoned criminal barrister was his role as a father. How did you tell the girls that their mother was missing?
Yeah, that was a very hard time. I told the girls, Mum hasn't been at work today, we don't know where she is, and there was just generally a state of confusion, disbelief, not knowing what had happened.
With no word from Corryn, the next 8 days were torture for her family.
Police Assistance Centre, how can I help you?
Then, on the 15th of August 2007, police received this phone call.
Oh, hi, look, I'm just wanting to report that missing car for the mother that's missing. I'm 1CDS 564.
Was that on the news, was it?
Yes, it was. It's that the Rayney woman, which is missing for over a week.
When they told me that Corryn's car was found, my first question was, was she in there? Fearing that she might have been killed and been inside there in the boot or somewhere. And they said no, she wasn't. So that was, again, maybe some hope that she can still be okay.
But that hope is soon extinguished. Corryn's car is found broken down 7.5 kilometres from the Rayneys' home. And in an extraordinary break, police are able to follow a trail created by oil leaking from the car's damaged sump. That trail leads them 3.5 kilometres into Perth's iconic Kings Park.
We could work out from the damage in the car that what actually happened.
Former Scotland Yard detective and now forensics expert Robin Napper explains the damage to Corryn's car was done as her killer or killers drove it over this bollard in their haste to get away.
So from this point out to the road and away down the road, we've got this oil trail, drip, 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 all the way to Kershaw Street in Subiaco, where the vehicle was found.
And so then a week later, the police followed the trail back to here.
They did, and then the forensic guys did a search and very quickly located the grave.
This is where the search ended, where Corryn's body was found, buried in scrub, just 50 metres from the road. It's a very lonely place, isn't it?
This is how nature intended it. Nobody would have found this.
To learn that Corryn had been put in this bush grave, what was that like to hear?
It was terrible. It was terrible. I remember thinking, I remember saying out loud, who kills someone and buries them in a grave in the middle of Kings Park like they're a dog? I mean, who would do that?
If not for the oil leak, who would have thought to look here? Whoever murdered Corryn inadvertently led police back to her bush grave. Now it was up to police to find who that was.
I can confirm that the human remains found in Kings Park this afternoon are those of Corryn Rayney. This now becomes a homicide investigation.
I told them that that Mum had been killed, and we just stood together, just the three of us, and just put our arms around each other. Tried to comfort them, but how do you comfort two girls who've lost their mum, and not just lost her, not It's not like this was a traffic accident or a death from an illness. It was... Their mum had been murdered. And then our lives were never the same.
Coming up, the largest murder investigation in WA history. Do you think the content of Corryn's emails turned the police against you?
That may have been a factor, yes.
Points to one man.
He is now a suspect in the murder of his wife.
But have detectives got it wrong? By being so fixated on Lloyd Rayney, what did they miss out doing?
They missed out on finding the murderer.
That's next on 60 Minutes. The discovery of Corryn Rayney's body in Perth's Kings Park in August 2007 sparked what would become the biggest murder investigation in WA history, certainly the most talked about. As fellow high-profile lawyer Martin Bennett observed, the public interest in the Rayney case bordered on obsessive.
The prominence of the couple, the terrible nature of that a woman can be abducted, go missing and her body be found in the centre of Perth in Kings Park in a grave, the hideous circumstance of the nature of the death, was she alive when she was buried? All of those matters contributed, I think, to the salaciousness, to the currency of the public interest.
Add to that mix the discovery that the Rayney union was not a perfect marriage. In fact, while they still lived under the same roof, Corryn and Lloyd had decided to separate, and their split was becoming more and more bitter. Then there was the revelation that on the very night Corryn was murdered, the pair had planned a special meeting to thrash out the thorny issues of finances and the custody of their two daughters. Take me back to the 7th of August 2007.
Yes.
This was meant to be a fairly momentous night for both you and Corryn. Why was that?
Well, we had agreed to meet and to talk sensibly without lawyers, just us, about how we can resolve whatever was outstanding.
Was there anything that you were hiding from her?
No.
Nothing at all?
No.
Are you prepared to be completely direct and honest today?
Yes.
That everything you say here is the truth?
Yes.
Lloyd, did you kill your wife?
No, I didn't. All I know is that the police are searching the home, hopefully.
While Lloyd says he was doing all he could to help police in their investigation,
I'm really hopeful that they can find something.
what he didn't know was their suspicion had fixed on him. In part maybe because of the accusations and threats to ruin his career contained in Corryn's emails, a motive perhaps. But they were the very emails Lloyd had helped police access the day she was reported missing. There was talk of gambling, there was talk of infidelity, there was talk of arguing over custody, demanding financial records and so forth. Do you think the content of Corryn's emails turned the police against you?
That may have been a factor, yes. But the emails to me were the things that I suppose couples that are separating say about each other.
Not nice.
Not nice, that's right.
Were they honest?
Some things she said were exaggerated and some things she said were not true. It was more acrimonious on Corryn's part than on mine.
And why do you think that was?
I think she wanted the separation more than I did.
My name is Detective Sergeant Hart, coming from the Major Crime Squad. We are here executing a search warrant.
This was the first clue for Lloyd that he was now the focus of the police investigation. 2 weeks after Corryn's murder, they came in force with a search warrant, despite being welcomed into his house many times before.
This was a pre-planned event for the media to film to show that they were coming to my home, looking for evidence, trying to implicate me.
They thought you had done something awful, right from the beginning.
They decided that I was Corryn's killer, right at the start.
What do you believe happened to Corryn?
I think most likely that she was attacked when she left boot scooting.
Their case was that Lloyd and Lloyd alone had actually committed the crime, taken the body to Kings Park and buried her.
Forensics expert Robin Napper, who would join Lloyd's defence team, also discovered evidence that police had made up their minds of Lloyd's guilt within 2 days of finding Corryn's body.
When we went through their critical issues log, like the diary of the investigation, we found that within 48 hours, they were talking about Lloyd as being a suspect. It was all Lloyd, and it was like a runaway train that nobody could stop.
If you are not guilty of this crime and
Yes.
you're being investigated by the police, I mean, do you just welcome the investigation and say, well, go your hardest, I've got nothing to hide?
Well, I did do that. And I had to do that because how else will Corryn's murder be solved other than by police doing it?
Did the girls ever ask you whether you were responsible for their mum's death?
No, of course not. More than anyone, Caitlin and Sarah knew me, knew Corryn, and knew our relationship. They knew me better than anyone. Not a moment have I had to ever reassure them.
A month later, on the 20th of September, again with the media in tow, police conduct another search at the family home. They arrest Lloyd on suspicion of bugging the home phone, charges that would prove to be baseless. But late that afternoon, another bombshell. The head of the investigation, Senior Sergeant Jack Lee, calls a press conference to claim a breakthrough in the murder case.
As a result of further investigations this morning, including the interview of Mr. Rayney, he is now a suspect in the murder of his wife. He is our prime suspect because our evidence at this time leads us to believe the offence occurred at that house. He's our only suspect at this time.
I had worked by that stage more than 20 years as a hard-working lawyer to build a career. 20 years. It took less than 20 minutes to destroy all that.
How did you see that destruction? What evidence did you have that your life had now changed?
Well, it changed immediately after that. I remember I had caught a taxi because the police had taken my car away. And the taxi driver had the news on.
Police have named the former DPP prosecutor as the prime suspect in the murder.
I remember the taxi driver shaking his head and saying, the husband did it. He hadn't recognised me, but he was convinced by what had been reported.
If you have the most senior officer handling the investigation say to the public at large that Corryn was killed at the Monash Street home at a time when Lloyd and his daughters were at home, that they have the evidence and he's their prime and their only suspect, then you're telling the world he killed his wife. It was repeated on the internet 600,000 times within 3 weeks. That cements a view.
By being so fixated on Lloyd Rayney, in your view, what did they miss out doing?
They missed out on finding the murderer.
Coming up.
This man has got the most horrendous record of sexual assault and violence.
The suspects and evidence.
And we've got his close associate flicking his cigarette butt allegedly outside of the house.
Police discounted.
These are the opportunities that are lost.
And the very public arrest of Lloyd Rayney. Why do you think they did that?
To cause maximum embarrassment, maximum humiliation.
That's next on 60 Minutes. As he himself documented, Lloyd Rayney came under repeated attack from complete strangers once he was named by police as the prime suspect in his wife's murder. Eggs thrown at his house. Dead crows left on his driveway and doorstep. And here, caught by CCTV, after Lloyd enters a local Perth bar, a woman runs up and tips a bucket of sanitary waste over him. The public clearly thought Lloyd guilty, as it seems did the police. An analysis of the police investigation into the murder of Corryn Rayney shows an extraordinary focus on Lloyd. 96% of their surveillance hours was spent following and watching Lloyd and those close to him. That's a lot of man-hours for one suspect, especially when there were two extremely violent sexual predators hiding in plain sight. Alan Mitchell-Lacko, described as one of Western Australia's worst violent offenders. Convicted of raping an 11-year-old girl, as well as many other sexual assaults, Lacko was living in an apartment block overlooking the Bentley Community Centre. The very place where Corryn regularly went boot scooting and where she was last seen alive.
This man has got the most horrendous record of sexual assault and violence. Awful man.
According to forensic specialist Robin Napper, police became aware the centre's car park was also Lacko's haunt, where he frequently sold drugs.
He was only ever superficially looked at, was never ever properly investigated at the time. And within 8 days of the murder, he had actually fled the state, jumped the border and went to South Australia.
Predator number 2, Ivan Eads, himself a violent sex offender, was Lacko's cousin and lived just around the corner from Corryn and Lloyd Rayney. Incredibly, during an early police search, a cigarette butt with Eads' DNA on it was found on the verge outside the Rayney home.
Now, that just went under the radar. They never did anything about this man at all, and you'd think in a major homicide investigation, they would have investigated that to the thorough end.
Phone records from a phone box on the corner also put Alan Lacko within a block of the Rayney house.
On the day that Corryn disappeared, he was making calls from the phone box at the top of the road. So we've got him at the phone box at the top of the road, and we've got his close associate, Eads, flicking his cigarette butt, allegedly, outside of the house.
Then, in another remarkable twist, the day after Corryn's body is found in a sandy grave in Kings Park, Alan Lacko is pulled over by police for driving without a licence. Police find a knife in the car and sand in his boot. In the course of his arrest, unprompted, Lacko mentions to police he'd heard a woman had been carjacked in Bentley and was now missing. Bentley was the suburb where Corryn was last seen alive, but no one had ever claimed she'd been carjacked. That reference to carjacking, the sand in the boot, as well as scratches on Lacko's arms, concerned those officers enough to contact the detectives investigating Corryn's murder. But those detectives did nothing. And there was still no alarm when police were contacted with information that a month before Corryn's murder, as he drove through Kings Park, Lacko told his passengers there's a body going in there. As a police officer, how would you describe the police case, how they conducted themselves?
Appalling. They didn't follow the leads they had.
A year later, WA police did finally track Lacko to Sydney, but they were looking for evidence of a link between Lloyd Rayney and an alleged hitman Lacko supposedly knew. Instead, they found a curious diary page for August 2007, the month Corryn was murdered. They also found a map of Kings Park, where Lacko once worked, and a floor plan of the Supreme Court, where, as we know, Corryn Rayney was a registrar. Police interviewed Lacko, but their investigation of him went no further.
He was carrying a map of the Supreme Court and a map of Kings Park. He'd worked at Kings Park, and he's got sand in the back of his car. Why were these matters not followed up? These are the opportunities that are lost.
For lawyer Martin Bennett, the circumstantial evidence, especially against Alan Lacko, was compelling. But police only had one man in their sights. And on the 8th of December 2010, in their most public display of force yet, police chose to pull Lloyd Rayney over in busy downtown Perth.
Have you any items in the car that we should be aware of that's going to cause any danger while our officers are going to look through the car?
3 years after Corryn's death, they finally charged Lloyd with her murder, and they wanted everyone to know it.
Lots of police in flak jackets, guns, arresting me symbolically 500 metres from where Corryn worked.
Why do you think they did that?
To cause maximum embarrassment, maximum humiliation, just on public display. The man arrested, handcuffed, and now we're bringing him to justice. That's what it was about.
Coming up.
They were convinced they would get overwhelming forensic evidence.
The police case stumbles in court.
I have put this evidence aside and ignored it.
Lloyd's own investigation, were you taking a gamble, proves crucial.
I can't see that there's any way he could have done it.
But has the damage already been done?
It was clear that they had behaved reprehensibly, but saying it doesn't cure the harm that they've caused to me.
That's next on 60 Minutes. On July 16th, 2012, the case against Lloyd Rayney was to be finally tested in court, to be heard over 12 weeks with 100 witnesses and 700 exhibits. It was described as the trial of the decade. But what it would expose was the full dimension of the police bias against Lloyd Rayney and the extent they went to prove he was the murderer, despite having compelling evidence he wasn't. It may have taken them 5 years to get their case to trial, but the police were unashamed in their solidarity against Lloyd Rayney. In a bizarre and blatant show of force, they all wore matching custom-made ties to court. Have you seen anything like that before?
Never. Never in my life I've seen that.
According to former Scotland Yard detective Robin Napper, it was the height of police arrogance. Just saying we're all on the same team.
We're all on the same team before they've even given evidence and had it tested in court before the judge.
The prosecution case was built on one overriding premise, that Corryn was murdered here at her home by Lloyd with their youngest daughter in the house at the time. The police say, waiting for his other daughter to come home, Lloyd hid Corryn's body until later that night, before dragging her into her car, which he'd also hidden, and then burying her in Kings Park. Now, if that was the scenario, then you'd imagine there'd be forensic evidence to prove it. Blood, signs of a clean-up, drag marks on the mossy driveway.
They brought in a full forensic team, and the full forensic team were going to scour the family home, which they fervently believed was the murder scene, and they were convinced they would get overwhelming forensic evidence. They got nothing. Not a thing.
What the police came up with was this seed pod, which they claimed they found in Corryn's body bag. Police said the pod came from the liquid amber tree at the Rayney home, which would help prove their case that Corryn was murdered there. Forensic tests on the pod initially looked damning for Lloyd, but as forensic expert Robin Napper says, it turned out to be far worse for the police.
That particular pod was absolutely loaded with forensic material from Lloyd's home address. Quite clearly, that had been in contact with the driveway, with some of the bushes. There was even traces of paint that came off the window. It was just totally unnatural what was found in that pod.
So what are you suggesting?
I'm suggesting that was planted.
Who by?
The police. People within the investigation.
The seed pod was meant to seal the police case and so Lloyd's fate. But everything about this perfect piece of evidence was questionable. Corryn's body bag, in which it was supposedly found, also contained 3 kilos of sand from her Kings Park gravesite. Despite that, the seed pod had no trace of that sand. Instead, everything on it came from Lloyd's house. Lloyd's barrister, QC David Edwardson.
It was so critical because it was such an extraordinary thing that it had all of these fragments that obviously came from Lloyd Rayney's property, but how could it possibly have ended up in the body bag in the way that they describe and not have a single grain of soil from Kings Park when it's amongst the soil? So it had to be a plant.
How would you describe that behaviour?
Well, it's appalling. It's criminal.
In a setback that all but destroyed the police case, the seed pod evidence was so dubious the trial judge, Brian Martin, refused to accept it.
My doubts are such that I cannot rely on the evidence concerning the finding of the seed pod in the body bag, and as a consequence, I have put this evidence aside and ignored it.
The police pursuit of Lloyd, a former senior state prosecutor, was unrelenting, even as their case was falling apart, and the evidence that Corryn was murdered at Kings Park was mounting. Why? Why were they so convinced it was you?
I don't know. I've asked myself that question many times. I don't know the answer. Was there someone who had a serious grudge against me because I'd prosecuted them before? I'd prosecuted police officers, I'd prosecuted politicians, I'd prosecuted a whole range across the spectrum. I don't know.
On the night Corryn disappeared, a resident from this tower block reported hearing a loud earth-shattering, high-pitched scream coming from below, somewhere nearby in Kings Park. It lasted about 2 minutes. But police were so certain that Corryn had been murdered at home that they wrote off that account, despite several other witnesses saying they heard the same scream.
If it's Lloyd, then the body has to be disposed of between a time of 1 a.m. and 3 a.m. So anyone who heard screaming in Kings Park at 11 p.m. that night can't be associated with the disposal of the body. That's the logic that they applied.
What do you think of that logic?
It's obviously wrong. Obviously, it's not logic at all. It's assumption that's used then to exclude facts that they should have been open to and they should have investigated.
Perth lawyer Martin Bennett has always believed in Lloyd's innocence. The police certain of his guilt. And the trial revealed just how investigators refused to test evidence that might prove them wrong. Most shockingly was the chance to determine scientifically where Corryn died. Their own expert, Dr. Dallas Mildenhall, told them nasal swabs collected at Corryn's autopsy could conclusively prove where she was last alive.
He told the police quite clearly the pollen in the back of the nose will reflect the last 40 minutes of life, and his main recommendation was get hold of those nasal swabs and analyse them. What did the police do? Nothing.
For 5 years, police had the nasal swabs and did nothing. At trial, Lloyd got special permission from the judge to finally have them tested. Were you taking a gamble?
I wasn't taking a gamble, but many people thought I was. In fact, some lawyers said, "Why would you do that, Lloyd? What if the swabs come back and show that Corryn took her last breaths here at home?" And I said, "Well, she didn't. She didn't come home. It's not a gamble."
How vital were those nasal swabs?
I think they were crucial.
So crucial, Dr. Lynn Milne's analysis of those swabs destroyed the police case. Australia's foremost forensic palynologist, Dr. Milne is a pollen expert whose tests proved Corryn could not have been killed at home.
I found that the swab sample had pollen from Kings Park and none from the Rayney home.
What did that finding tell you?
That meant to me that she was actually breathing when the pollen got there.
She was breathing, she was alive at Kings Park.
Yeah.
The fact that you didn't find any pollen samples from Como, her home, what does that tell you?
Well, it tells me that she wasn't killed at her home.
Well, that's critical, isn't it? I mean, that was the police case, that she was killed at home.
She was killed at her home. I couldn't find any pollen from the home.
To Dr. Milne, there's no doubt Lloyd Rayney is an innocent man.
I can't see that there's any way he could have done it.
Scientifically, if you look at the science behind it...
There's no way.
Corryn's cause of death has never been established, but there is some evidence that it may have been a sexual assault gone wrong. Her torn shirt and ripped jean zipper. The police dismissed that evidence, but their zealotry in trying to gather other material to implicate Lloyd brought a damning rebuke from trial judge Justice Brian Martin.
Concerning various aspects of the conduct of the police investigators, there are instances of conduct ranging from inappropriate to reprehensible.
Do you feel vindicated in any way that the judge said that?
Well, it was clear that they had behaved reprehensibly, but saying it doesn't cure the harm that they've caused to me and to our children.
Coming up.
The only person that didn't appear to be nervous was Lloyd Rayney.
The verdict is in.
There was never a case that I'd murdered Corryn.
Criticism from the judge,
The absence of evidence tells strongly against the state.
but still no apologies from police.
And the injustice is not just to me, it's to my children and it's to everybody who ever knew Corryn.
That's next on 60 Minutes. November 1st, 2012 is Judgment Day for Lloyd Rayney.
There was a media throng like you wouldn't believe. There were more reporters and journalists and camera crews than even at the start of the trial, and there were reporters from all over Australia.
The police investigation and the state prosecution case cost Western Australian taxpayers $20 million. So for them too, this was a day of reckoning. As Lloyd's Queen's Counsel, David Edwardson, remembers, anxiety levels were high on both sides of the courtroom.
Judgment Day, to say the least, is probably one of the most nervous days I've ever had in my life. It was extraordinary. In fact, the only person that didn't appear to be nervous was Lloyd Rayney. And he, despite being that lonely figure that sat in the dock throughout that trial, right to the end, was supremely confident. He said, "Don't worry, David, I'll be acquitted." And he was right.
Five long years after Corryn was murdered and 4 months after the trial began, Justice Brian Martin agreed with Lloyd, declaring him innocent and finding the prosecution had failed.
The case for the state is beset by improbabilities and uncertainties. Crucial evidence is lacking, and the absence of evidence tells strongly against the state. I find the accused not guilty of willful murder.
Despite the best funded investigation, despite unlimited, apparently, resources at the disposal of those people investigating, this is still unsolved. And that's an extremely hard thing for my family to accept.
Were you confident that you would be found not guilty?
Absolutely. All I needed was a fair trial. I never for a moment doubted that I'd be acquitted, because there was no evidence. There was never a case that I'd murdered Corryn. And that's the result.
Three times Lloyd has been judged and found innocent at his murder trial, at the prosecution's appeal, and in a defamation case against the WA police last year, where he won a record payout of $2.6 million when represented by lawyer Martin Bennett. But still, financially and by reputation, Lloyd is a ruined man.
Lloyd was running this by himself with no assets, totally wiped out. And this damage will continue for the rest of his career.
You describe the effect on Lloyd's reputation as a dreadful stain, a poison incapable of being expunged.
Hasn't been expunged. All that occurs is people now say, well, he obviously didn't kill her, he arranged for someone to kill her. They just adjust their view to still attribute guilt, but he must be very clever to have got away with it type of thing.
And those who've helped defend Lloyd have also found themselves under attack.
I've received for 7 years anonymous hate mail for acting for Lloyd.
Somebody once said to me, "Why did you get him off?" And I said, "I didn't. He didn't do it." But, face was right in my nose. It was horrible, really nasty.
Any of us that believed in Lloyd's innocence, any of us that have worked with him, we've all been subject to the same abuse. Utterly, utterly insulting.
It's extraordinary, but Lloyd's acquittal seems to have done nothing to shift the WA police view that he's guilty. It's certainly done nothing to spur them on to look for who did kill Corryn.
The one thing that would go a long way is for the police, proper, right-minded, courageous police, independent of what has happened before, to do their job now. That's my hope.
So currently, do you think the WA police still believe Lloyd Rayney is guilty of the murder of his wife?
I don't know whether they believe he's guilty or not. What I do know, and think at least, is that they can't admit that they got it absolutely wrong right from the beginning. And therein, I think, lies the problem.
Even if that means letting murderers walk the streets?
Well, precisely yes.
As for the two violent sex predators police did at least interview, Alan Lacko is in jail, awaiting sentencing on 14 unrelated charges, including assault, while the whereabouts of Ivan Eads is unknown. Police seem to have no interest in investigating them further.
The key to it is the lesson, and whether that lesson's been learnt or not, I don't know. We'll have to see. We'll wait for another case where an innocent person's accused and prosecuted of a crime and a guilty person goes free.
It's now 11 years since that unimaginable night, since these sisters lost their mother. And for 11 years, Caitlin and Sarah have watched their father pursued and persecuted. Without a renewed commitment to find Corryn's killer, it's all been for nothing. Your daughter Sarah has said that our lives have gotten worse and worse, especially for my father more than anyone else. Is that how you would describe life still?
Well, what has never changed is that Corryn's killer has never been prosecuted. So in that regard, yes. Nothing gets better until that happens. To investigate me alone to the exclusion of others, that's completely wrong. And that's what's caused this injustice. And the injustice is not just to me, it's to my children, and it's to everybody who ever knew Corryn, everybody who ever loved her. That's the injustice.
And to Corryn herself?
Of course. And as well as that, there is a person or people walking around who've literally got away with murder.
Hello, I'm Tara Brown. Thanks for watching. To keep up with the latest from 60 Minutes Australia, make sure you subscribe to our channel. You can also download the 9Now app for full episodes and other exclusive 60 Minutes content.